This is a sort of a odd webinar. I suspect it's sort of bubbling up. It's been bubbling up for me for a while, and I I've been doing performance consulting work of various kinds, performance improvement work for over 50 years, which is hard to believe. I see Rogers here, and he's probably he's probably ahead of me in that regard. But I've done all kinds of stuff. Giant companies. I just saw that Oracle, a former client, has now become perhaps, well, Larry Ellison has possibly become the next, multi-trillionaire. And I work for Oracle. I work for Microsoft and Genentech and Amgen and big companies and a lot of small companies, telecom, high tech, small applied behavior analysis companies, startups, you name it, and done a lot of projects in sales and customer service and factory maintenance and lots of other areas, done process improvement, like some of you have done lots of different kinds of things. And over the years, when I got turned on to accomplishment-based performance improvement, and I got involved with the International Society for Performance Improvement, and I wound up learning a lot from Tom Gilbert and Joe Harless and some of our other colleagues. I, like those of you who are here, I'm guessing, have been sort of a lifetime learner. And what I notice is that I'm still learning stuff. And again, I see Roger, and it's always the bottom of his emails, still learning, And in the process of this, we've developed this thing we call performance thinking, which is a set of simple models that all of you know about just about when I look down the list. And but I'm going to talk about just briefly the details, some of the details that are relevant here, especially for the sake of those who are not that familiar, who have not been through our programs or been to a bazillion of these webinars and so forth. But what I've noticed is that I walk around, and a lot of my colleagues who I stay in close touch with, who've been using these models and this approach for a long time, we have a lot of insights. We have a lot of new learnings. We have lot of opportunities where it's not just here's a project, we better pull out this methodology. It becomes a way of viewing the world. And so it occurred to me that that was worth exploring to some extent and getting some documentation of. So that's what this is about, and we'll see what it means. And what I mean by hiding in plain sight is that, again, among most of my performance improvement colleagues, they have their models and methodologies, and they sort of, oops, here's a project, we're going to pull that out. But what I've noticed is that enormous amount of the work that I do, and a lot of the opportunities I have just to have informal discussions with people, even in my family, even in my household, the implications of and the insights that come from these models have made a big difference. So before we get into it, if you're watching the recording, I think all of you know we record these and put them up on YouTube. If you're watching it, please like and share, and especially share, send to your colleagues, post in LinkedIn, wherever it is you live online, because of course we like to get the word out. And the other thing is, and this is a shameless commerce part, our 4 times a year open performance thinking practitioner certification program. Next one's going to be in January, and we need people to register by early January in order to get the materials and so forth. This is an interesting program because we also, of course, do it inside of companies. We're right at the verge now of starting up. Interesting one for a school district. I've never done this for a bunch of senior people in a school district. And we're also going to be doing it for a biotech company in-house. But 4 times a year, we have this open program. So it's just worth knowing about if you don't already. And as I look at the list, a lot of you have been through it. So here's kind of an agenda. And it's not really exactly an agenda, but it's sort of the themes and topics that come out of this. I think, as I say in the first line, the secret, I think, is simplicity and plain language, because I think what's made this approach that's really evolved among me and some of you and a lot of my colleagues over the years is the simplicity and clarity of it because of its plain language, and how that's really what allows a lot of what I'm going to talk about to happen. The other thing is always worth noting, since I was one of B.F. Skinner's last doctoral students in behavior science, and I'm very proud of that because He was my mentor and he changed my life. But, the human performance technology or performance improvement, which is the methodology that we share, the field that we talk about, really is, at least the way we teach it, grounded in elements of Dr. Skinner's behavior science, which I want to talk briefly about. And then the other thing is that we have this thing we call performance thinking logic, which simply goes through a series of steps of analysis and design with a significant component of design thinking. And what I've learned is that I have never seen a kind of project or a kind of application where it is not applicable. And I want to talk about the way we think about that. And then, the next bullet there, big, hairy projects and in the moment opportunities. When I speak with folks, and some of you are here, who have been using our performance thinking methodology for a long time, and for that matter, some of my other colleagues, although I think this methodology makes it more um, applicable in simple, informal settings, is that people apply performance thinking in both big projects, big, hairy projects, as I described them there, but also many, many in the moment opportunities. Like in a meeting, something comes up and you have an insight based on your knowledge about performance, or you're having a conversation with somebody who's having a challenge, or even in your family. And I'll try to remember to tell a family example or two. We say, oh, we could do a better job with this. And what I'm told by a lot of my colleagues, and I think it's true of me as well, is that maybe 20 or 30% of our work are formal projects. Far more of our applications of performance improvement, performance thinking in particular, are informal, ad hoc, in meetings, in conversations, day-to-day things. And so I think that's kind of interesting that there's both those kinds of things. This isn't just some big thing that you pull out when you have a big project. And then um, there's a thing about understanding human performance where it's not just that you have sort of your nose in a methodology and are following steps, ADDIE, or you're using Joe Harless's job aids or whatever it is, but you stand back and because of the models we have, the simplicity of them, um, it kind of integrates your view of how you look at human performance, human behavior, and its valuable products, and it gives rise to insights. And I think that's a big deal. And then what I want to do is I want to see. I'm hoping a few of you here will can add to this toward the end of this, and then we'll have a few summary takeaways. And I'm not kidding about this. I'm pretty bad because I tend to be Dr. Binder lecturing and such. But I don't know if I do a very good job of encouraging people to contribute questions, comments, and so forth. But my hope is that those of you who are here with us will maybe take out a notepad and actively take down examples, not from what I say, but from your own experience of either insights you've had about performance or examples of how maybe performance thinking has helped you, because just about everybody here I see in this list has had some contact with this work. And share some of your insights, some of your examples, and also if you got questions, please ask. So I'd really appreciate you from now on thinking about that for the next 40 minutes or so and taking some notes so you have some stuff to ask or say when we get toward the end. Now, I think simplicity is a big deal. And I was asked to give a talk. I'm going to actually turn off my video right now because I think it's a distraction and it also gets in the way of the slides. But I was asked to do an invited talk at the Association for Behavior Analysis Intervention about almost 10 years ago now. And it's one of those things where you get to do whatever you want. They say, hey, would you come and talk? And oh, good, I can talk about some new thing. And what I recognized in my own history was that I was incredibly influenced by Steve Jobs. And that's what that book, Ken Segal's book, The Obsession That Drives Apple's Success, was about: simplicity. It's a really good book if you've never read it. It's a quick read, but it's about how Jobs focus on simplicity of making user interfaces simple, organization simple, meetings simple, drove a whole lot of things at Apple. And but not only that, I learned from Bob Horn, my friend and mentor and creator of the information mapping method, about things like chunking, into lists of 7 plus or minus items, hierarchical organization, labeling, doing things that help essentially our interface with the world, if you will, becomes simpler and easier to comprehend. And so I gave a whole talk about that quite a few years ago, and there's a link to that if you ever wanted to watch it. But I think this quotation from Steve Jobs, which I quote almost all the time when I'm introducing this work these days, is kind of important because when I first read it in that book by Ken Segall, Insanely Simple, I realized this was kind of how my journey in performance improvement has happened. And Steve said, when you start looking at a problem and it seems really simple, with all these simple solutions, you don't really understand the complexity of the problem. And I think that is, for example, in some cases, an example of that is this simplistic application of behavior science, where we're just talking about antecedents and consequences, and we're doing kind of simple OBM with consequences, so organizational behavior management. But he says, then you get into the problem and you see it's really complicated, and you come up with all these convoluted solutions, and that's sort of the middle. And it's where most people stop, and the solutions tend to work for a while. And I would say that's where behavioral systems in the organizational behavior management world and a lot of the models in human performance improvement got to, where they were really complex. And I have colleagues who have books filled with diagrams and stuff that are overwhelming. And they capture important stuff, but they're complicated. And so Steve goes on to say, but you can keep on going and find the key underlying principle of the problem and come up with a beautiful, elegant solution that works. Now, in my experience, Tom Gilbert's behavior engineering model is a sort of a simple example of that. And as you all, I think, know, we've plain Englished it in a way that makes it a little more accessible for people. Um, but this is kind of the journey that I've gone through. And I think simplicity makes a big difference in terms of our ability to have an impact, to communicate with our clients and stakeholders, and also to collaborate with them. Now, here's just a few models. There was an article in the 90s about human performance improvement models, and this is just four of them. I think there were like 17, and they're all good. They're all different slices through our understanding of behavior and accomplishments and performance. And one of my experiences has been over the years among my colleagues. Some of you included, but I've had a lot of really, really extraordinary performance improvement colleagues over the years, and people who are very skilled and who've done very complex projects and, big deals, made a big difference. And what I've always found fascinating about all of that is that what they do is they kind of are in a project or they're faced with a problem and they sort of pull out one of the models, and they don't always use the same one. It depends very much on the individual's expertise and history about what he or she knows about. And so, like, which one do you use in a given situation? That was always kind of a challenge, and for me as a problem, because as I began really in the 80s and certainly in the 90s to begin teaching people in my client organizations how to do performance improvement, I wanted to come up with a framework that we could all agree on and that seemed comprehensive and that covered the whole deal. Now, Roger, I see you again, Roger, but and folks at the International Society for Performance Improvement um, put together a bunch of the elements from instruction and performance and so forth into what's been called the HPT model. And it's been published in lots of different ways. This happens to have been one that was in an article, but this model on the left for many years was on the ISPI, International Society for Performance Improvement website. And it's beautiful in many ways. It has kind of everything you'd want to know. And this isn't this, there's the model that I usually show is a little even more complex than that, but there's a lot of stuff in there. And I've had clients where this was on their wall. I remember years ago, I had a client in a medical organization, and I went in, it was the head of learning and development. And I went in and they had a big poster of the HPT model on the wall. And she said, we've been trying to do this, but it's really complicated, and executives come by and they say, how long is this going to take? And this looks like analysis paralysis and so forth. And so over the years, based really on most of all input from Gilbert and Joe Harless and a few other people, we came up with this thing on the right, which I'm going to drill into a bit. But my thesis here is this model is all you need to know. and that you don't, yes, all those other things are important, but fundamentally, if you follow this, and I'm going to step you through it, this is really all you need to be able to do to attack virtually any kind of issue that involves human performance. Now, as I mentioned already, for me at least, and I think for the field of performance improvement, it does go back to Tom Gilbert. He was a iconoclastic, brilliant character, and he got in fights with lots of people, and he liked to poke you in the eye and stuff. And I have more than one colleague who tried to do business with him and find it difficult. But be that as it may, his book, Human Competence, of which his late wife, Marilyn, was an important contributor. I don't think that book would have existed without her. It was published in 1978, and it's still being taught in some graduate programs that I know about. So it's a big deal. And in it, he made this statement, which I've quoted to probably thousands of people now. He says, in the great cult of behavior, behavior itself is viewed as an end rather than as a means to an end. And he didn't mean behaviorists. He meant everybody. He meant leaders, trainers, managers, HR people, you name it. He said, we must enable people to produce accomplishments, the valuable products of behavior. Now, we're still debating what we're going to do, but I think next month we're going to do a webinar on what it means, what an accomplishment really is, because there's a whole conversation about that you can have. But be that as it may, we have a very specific way of defining it. And we mean the valuable things that individuals, teams, or processes produce. And we call them work outputs. The reason I coined that term years ago was because I encountered a lot of my colleagues who used the word accomplishments actually in somewhat different ways. And I didn't want to argue with them. So we came up with this phrase. It's similar to phrases that other people have used. But work implies, in the world of work, activity, behavior, and outputs are countable because obviously it's plural. So that's what we mean. So this was foundational. And the model that we came out of after years and influenced by Harless and other people was what we call the performance chain. And we just say there's 4 components to it. There's behavior influences, which are all the things that we either arrange or that are already in place that either support behavior or get in the way. There's the behavior that's needed to produce those work outputs that meet criteria for what we call good, or standards, if you will, that if they're valuable, they contribute to business or organizational results. Those are the 4 elements that we would say of performance, or actually 3 elements of performance and the things that influence it. And as the arrows point out, we analyze it starting with the end in mind, and it works from left to right. Now it's anchored in work outputs or accomplishments, because at least maybe some of you have done projects where people said, well, we need to increase some business result. What do you think the outputs are? In most cases, at least the work that I've done at any level, I've been brought in to look at some hunk of performance. And the challenge is not deciding what outputs we ought to focus on. It's actually identifying them, which is not always easy. There's a lot of ways we do that. But we anchor it to work outputs, and the words below each of these segments are just examples, really. And the work outputs language, they are just words that we've found over about 30 years are helpful in conversations to ask about. But this is the model we use to define the elements of performance, and most of you are familiar with it, I think. Now, Gilbert had this wonderful formula where he talked about, and some people apply this quantitatively. I don't necessarily, but I think it's an important conceptual way to think about stuff. He said the worth of an intervention, whether it's training or non-training, a new system, coaching, I don't care what it is, the worth of that intervention, he would say, is equal to the value of the accomplishments that it enables people to produce or increase, divided by the cost of behavior. And by cost of behavior, he means everything that, he means hiring and supporting and providing a place to work and computers and salary and all the rest of it, in addition to, let's say, designing training or some other intervention and investing in it and taking people off and off the job. That can add up to a lot. And if you just think about this conceptually and take a look at, for example, training programs that you might have been involved in over the years, either as a trainee or as a designer or as a facilitator, you probably can identify a few of them where the cost might have been a lot more than the value of the accomplishments that they produced. Now, to bring that into the current era, people would talk about return on investment. And I personally think that one of the big insights about being accomplishment based is because it focuses on value, it gives us almost like a direct line to return on investment because it's the value of the accomplishments, which are the return. And sometimes we can quantify those in dollars and cents, and sometimes in other ways, but we can still identify them. That's what we're trying to get here. We're not just talking about behavior because behavior is not useful unless it produces something valuable in the organization. So that's, I think, a first big insight about being accomplishment based. Now, one of the things also about this performance chain is it links this nicely into measurement. There's all kinds of conversations about measurement and Kirkpatrick's model and all the rest of it, or ROI, et cetera. And as a behavior scientist, I was trained to use things that used standard units of measurement. The reason that Skinner's science was a natural science, like physics or chemistry or biology, is because he used standard universal metrics of time and count of things, et cetera, much like physics does. He didn't use things like percent correct or percent of intervals or rating scales. He didn't use things where the actual measure, the unit of measurement depends on the variability of the thing that's being measured, which means it's not absolute and standard like the measures we use in physics and such. So I'm always going for stuff that you can count. And you can count in whatever units you're talking about business results. You can measure, but the challenge with business result measures, we always got to be paying attention to them, and usually the executives or the CFO or whoever it is, but often things like revenue and profit and customer satisfaction and market share, those are lagging indicators. So it's important to keep track of them. But of course, you don't get very many data points in most cases, so you don't get opportunity to make a lot of decisions. We can also measure behavior. And the behaviorists in the crowd here know about that. And there's lots of ways of observing and counting behavior. But measurement of behavior does not equate to asking the managers 2 months later whether we thought there was an impact on behavior. That's refined opinion, as a colleague of mine used to say. It's not even very refined. What we're talking about is you can count behavior, you can checklist it. It's very important to do in many cases, like if you're trying to diagnose why some problem happened, or if you're trying to be sure people are following safety procedures, or if it's very important to do something in exactly a specific way. It's important to observe behavior, but it does cost time, and you got to usually observe people. But still, you can count it and use standard units of measurement. And then work outputs, which I think are the highly underutilized thing when it comes to measurement. Because if we define the work outputs of individuals, teams, or processes, and we define what a good one is, what we call criteria, we can count them. We can count the good ones and not so good ones. We can see if there are more successful proposals this month. We can see if there's more widgets without defects, more good hiring decisions, more recommendations that were clear and had an impact on people, et cetera. And these are relatively leading indicators in most cases. So to me, work outputs are the magical thing that Tom Gilbert really sort of focused us on, which allow us to measure. So that's a part where this approach that we're talking about, and accomplishment-based performance improvement in general, aligns nicely with natural science. Now, another part of natural science was Skinner's so-called three-term contingency. For behaviorists in the group, you'll recognize that phrase. But what this sort of nerdy equation was, if you will, was Skinner's way of talking about the science that he developed in the laboratory. So an SD is a discriminative stimulus. It's a thing that becomes a signal or a prompt or a cue to respond. And if it's effective, it sets the occasion for a response. And if that response is a good one, then hopefully it produces a reinforcing stimulus. And so that was Skinner's science, and the whole field of behavior analysis was built on this framework. But what Gilbert recognized was, first of all, we're not white Carnot pigeons and laboratory rats. So the instruments that we use, the tools that we use, were not necessarily built perfectly for us, as anyone who's ever used a bad piece of software can tell you. In the lab, we actually build the so-called manipulanda, the keys and the levers and stuff for the animals to fit them, or for people. But what Tom recognized is that in the world of work, for real, for humans, you got to look at this in two levels. You got to see what the environment provides, the information it provides, he called data, the instruments, and that's where the tools, the software, the whatever it is would be, because they may or may not work. It's possible we should improve them, including reference materials, documents, job aids, and so forth. And then motives, he used the word incentives. The problem with incentives is it's usually implies something you already know about, and there's a lot of unintended consequences that affect behavior. So that word doesn't quite work. Just like data is a bit of a problem, is what kind of data are we talking about? But in any case, that's the environment. And what he recognizes is for us humans, we also as individuals either need to acquire or have knowledge. You could say knowledge and skills, maybe, capacity, which means we have to be a good fit for whatever the requirements of the job are. And motives was his way of, from a behavior science, I think, point of view, taking into account the fact that incentives will only work if they appeal to the motivation of the person. So my silly example is always, well, if the trip to Hawaii and President's Club is the big payoff for doing great, and I don't like the sun or the beach, that might not be a big reinforcer for me. Maybe something else would be. So this was Tom's model, and it's a brilliant model. And that's why so many, probably tens of thousands of people have used it for so long, because it covers all of the possible variables, or at least it potentially does. However, what we learned, and maybe some of you have encountered, is that when we tried to partner with stakeholders, when we tried to engage our colleagues, they were often confused. They'd say stuff like data, like what do you mean, spreadsheets, or what is that? Instruments, that sounds like a guitar or an ohm meter. What is that? Etc. So the language, what we found was when we tried to teach people this, to identify behavior influences for people and to then sort them and so forth, that they made a lot of category errors. So it was very frustrating. And a lot of our colleagues, I think, in the 80s tweaked this language and still called it the behavior engineering model, but they came up with their own vocabulary. And so did we. And so during the 80s, I spent a lot of time training people in this stuff. And we spent a lot of time tweaking the language and user testing it to see if people could make the categories, sort things properly and so forth. And this is what we came up with. And it's called the six boxes model, and it's become a big enough deal that we copyrighted and trademarked it, because there are publications out there now that call, for example, Tom Gilbert's model the six boxes model, or they call this the behavior engineering model, or they call some other wacky things, or they change their language. And this is a specific user-tested framework where the language is well-defined and it is not going to change. And this is a six boxes model. So what we find is it's very useful. And if you want to know about that, you can take a deeper dive in a webinar that we did on a couple years ago, where it came from. But this, in my view, and in my experiences, summarizes all the variables that can possibly influence behavior. And almost everybody in this list has seen this before. A big aspect of this is that this is not just a list of six, a set of six lists. These variables all connect to one another. And if they don't, you probably got a problem. So if expectations don't line up with consequences, you better make them line up, because, as Aubrey Daniels used to say, you can tell people to do something, but if nothing good ever happens when they do it, they're probably going to quit listening to you. Or you might have skills and knowledge, but the tools you're given might really be terrible. So we might need to change the tools. Or similarly, we might give people a new set of tools, and we need to develop the skills for using them. Or we can, as I've seen countless times, we can hire people into jobs where expectations are just not clear, where the job descriptions are not representative of what the job is, and we have problems with that, etc. So these are integrated, and you can go through the exercise of identifying links between all of them. And it's kind of an interesting exercise to do with a group of people. And my view is that this is a big kind of secret, if you will, to return on investment. Because what we're looking for when we design some intervention, we want to be sure all these categories are covered, essentially, that they're positive and that they all line up with one another and that they're as cost effective as they can be. So, as you probably all know very well, one of the biggest mistakes is to put everything on the shoulders of training, skills, and knowledge. Because you can, if you give people really good tools and job aids and you set expectations and provide them feedback, you in many cases might not even have to take them away for training. And so optimizing this is a big secret, if you will, for return on investment. Now, that also leads to another thing, and this is another, for me, big insight. I spent many years just doing performance improvement projects. But what we recognize, as all of you know very well, that if you're going to implement some new intervention, some new system, some new set of interventions in an organization, you got to have leaders and managers to partner with. Because if you don't, they control the top row in that model, especially how they set expectations and provide feedback and so forth. And as performance professionals, we don't have much control over that. So we developed a coaching and leadership and management set of curricula, which were boiled down to this, in which we said, look, a lot of leaders and managers kind of think, especially new ones, kind of think they're supposed to be the smartest person on the team. And while that may or may not be the case, that is not their fundamental job. Their job is to arrange behavior influences for people that they lead and manage to optimize both productivity and engagement. Because we can optimize productivity by whipping people and turning them into slaves, but they're not going to be happy campers and they'll leave. And similarly, we can have people very happy, but we don't actually give them conditions to perform well, and probably they'll leave then too eventually. But those two things go together. That is productivity and engagement. We got to do those things so they fit together. And in my view, it's the role of leaders and managers at every level to be sure the conditions or the behavior influences for their people are optimized in that way. And that's going to produce return on investment as well as things like better employee engagement. So to me, this was a framework that also made big sense. And there's a lot of implications and insights that come out of this that you can talk to leaders and managers about. And in fact, and I don't want to make this a big deal of this. I always have to say this because this was only a small group of people at the 2022 ISPI International Conference. But somebody that I didn't know he was going to do this set up a session in which they nominated and voted for the best performance model in the world. And guess what? The Six Boxes model won. Now, I don't make a big deal of this other than the fact that enough people in my field, enough colleagues think this is true, that it reflects the usefulness, the practicality of it. Now, if you take these two things that I've shown you, what I always say is two simple pictures, that is the performance chain and the Six Boxes model, each of which is well within our chunking limit of 5 plus or minus 2 things, and you paste them together, you have the foundation for what we call performance thinking logic. And what we say is whether it's an informal project or a informal opportunity or a big deal project, we want to be sure we know what's at stake. What's at stake for the organization are trying to improve this? Why are we doing this again? Is this about productivity or market share or profits or safety, or what is this about for the organization? Once we're clear on that, because that may affect the way we deal with other stuff, now we say, okay, let's take a look at the hunk of performance that we've been asked to investigate, whether it's some big process or whether it's the performance of a role or an individual, or whether it's a change management effort where we want people to be producing new outputs or possibly the same old outputs in a new way, or whether it's even a cultural intervention where we say we want people to be productive and produce the outputs, but we want to have them do it in a certain way that aligns with our values. Whatever the kind of project is, we need to identify the accomplishments or work outputs because that's the anchor. And we also, that little circle indicates, we want to be sure that those outputs credibly contribute to business results. We don't have to do some sort of Harvard Business Review research project in most cases. Usually, if we're speaking with somebody who's a customer service rep and they're supposed to produce notes after each call, which would be a work output, we can say, look, if these are real clear and you write them, as following the framework that we've given you, that will enable the next person that gets a call from that person to get up to speed real fast. It's likely to impact customer satisfaction, and it will certainly impact productivity. So usually we can credibly see how a work output contributes to organizational business results. And if we can't, we might want to consider whether to still produce it or not. Once we know that, to me, the beauty of an accomplishment based approach is that it leads us to the behavior. And that can't be said for an awful lot of other methodologies out there in HR and talent development, where people say, well, you should ask a lot of open ended questions, or you should do this, do that. Why? If we know what the products of behavior is supposed to be, we can observe successful performers. We can do task analysis. We can identify super successful performers, exemplary performers, identify the behavior that needs to be in place to actually produce those work outputs. And once we do that, we've got these three things identified. We can, as I mentioned earlier, we can identify measures. We can say, okay, well, let's take a look at this. What are the outputs? What are the business results? What behaviors involved? What data can we get on a regular basis to maybe establish a baseline and then see if we're making a difference? What's accessible here? But the point is, those three things give us the domains of measurement to consider. Once we have an idea of how we might measure, and maybe we even start doing it, then we can take a look at the behavior influences using the 6 boxes model. And we teach a design thinking thing there where we say, okay, look at the performance, interview people, observe people, whatever it takes to figure out for the hunks of behavior needed to produce the outputs, what's working in each of the cells of the 6 boxes model. What are the pluses? What's maybe working against them, like unreadable documentation or a lot of punishment, mostly not much positive consequences, or lack of skills, whatever it is. So we analyze it, and then we say, let's brainstorm some ways to improve those things which were lacking or working in the wrong direction. And that's the little design thinking bit we stuck in there about 15 years ago, largely under the influence of our friend Surya Vanka, who used to be director of user experience at Microsoft. He's a design thinking guy. And we realized that people often jump from whatever they think the problem is to the usual solutions. And we wanted people to stop for a bit, and ideally with stakeholders say, well, what can we do here? Should we give them some job aids, or can we use a little online tool here? Or do we want to just have the managers circulating and giving people good feedback? What is it that we can do here? What are some ideas? And then, ideally, with stakeholders, we choose. We say, let's configure the best combination of behavior influences to optimize this performance. Now, we don't know for sure if we got it right, but if we go through that process, we got a heck of a lot better chance of at least having a pretty compelling configuration of behavior influences. Then we implement, measure, and we almost always need to adjust if we're given the opportunity, because we sort of have to. I mean, we never get it completely right, or don't usually. And hopefully we can approach this in an agile way that drives continuous improvement. And then in our work, because we've just got, if you count them, we've got 21 plain English words and 2 pictures. We share the language and models with people. We draw them on envelopes. We talk about them on slides. When I go in first for a senior executive in a new project, I'll very often ask them to use their whiteboard, or if it's a Zoom meeting, we'll do it that way. But I'll say, it's kind of the way we think about it. And I share this, and I don't usually get people saying, that doesn't make any sense. Now, I've already mentioned, of course, the work outputs or accomplishments are at the core of this stuff. And so we have tools for identifying them. In this case, this happens to be the work outputs of an individual. He was the head of talent acquisition at a Dubai-based a large company, but these are his outputs. The things in the bubbles around the side are the customers that he delivered to, and the things in the bulleted lists are outputs. That's what we call an individual performance map, which we've used over the years. And of course, if we're looking at a process, here's a little slice of a process. This is, I want to make a shout out to Holly Almond, my wonderful colleague who's in the applied behavior analysis world and who is also a superb performance improvement professional. This is the way she's figured out how to have both outputs and behavior in a process map. And I think it's really sweet. It's, the white boxes there have the behavior, as you can see that. And then the little purple bubbly things are are the outputs. And it's a really nice way to be able to look at both of them on the same graphic. So we can identify the work outputs. We figure out what the steps are in the process, and we say, what does that produce? So I also want to quote my former partner, Cynthia Rhea. I've been saying this for a long time, following her. She had this phrase where she talked about work outputs liberate behavior. And what she meant by that is that, if we know what you're supposed to produce, that there may be a number of different ways you can produce that in terms of the behavior for producing it. And that is really helpful to think about in many ways. If we're talking to managers who are coaching other folks, and that's which her area of focus was in our business, we can say, you can help your people produce these things, and there may be a standard way of doing it, but it might be that you could discover some of the folks in the team have discovered new ways to do it that are really good. Now, of course, we don't want to be liberating behavior in a nuclear plant or a biotech factory. But there's an awful lot of jobs where if you can produce the same thing, like, for example, I've worked with salespeople who wanted to develop strong relationships with their major influencers in their accounts. Some of them will invite them to Super Bowl parties. Some of them will have lunch meetings with them. Some of them will just send them useful updates. They'll do a whole lot of stuff, but the intention is to improve and develop and strengthen their relationship, which is the output they're working on. So I think this is important. And one of the reasons it's important is it opens up the possibility of doing something, another thing that Tom Gilbert taught us about, which is the notion of exemplary performance, exemplary behavior. And so this is kind of a funny graphic display. But if you look up the left, if you took some area of performance, a job, a role, closed deals for salespeople, widgets for a team of manufacturing people, whatever it is, if you look at the outputs, usually you can look at, there's something like a normal curve. It may not be as sweet and be perfect as this, but the goldish curve is sort of the way it is. The way there's some people who are not performing very well at all, and they may have all kinds of issues, and there's a lot of people in the middle, and then there may be some superstars at the top. And as Gilbert pointed out, in some areas of performance, people might produce outputs or accomplishments multiple times more than the average. And so the bigger that range, he called it potential for improving performance. And we changed that to upside potential years ago because PIPs also means performance improvement plans in some organizations, which is kind of not a very nice thing in most cases. So we call it upside potential. But in any case, if the gap between the average performers and the top performers is significant, it means that if we could discover some things to help everybody perform a little bit better, we'd get what the green curve there it looks like, which is just raise it a little bit. And if you look at the aggregate improvement across everybody, that could be worth a lot of money or time or productivity. Now, if you turn that into a effort to figure out what those things are, one of the things we know, and most of you I think are pretty familiar with this, top performers never are better at everything. Usually there's some small bit of things that we have to watch and even ask them about, why did you do that? And they say, okay, this, whatever it is. They're usually unconsciously competent in some of those things. So we have a logic that uses the performance chain where we say, okay, let's identify these superstars. Let's observe and interview them and try to figure out how they're doing this. And then let's share those best practices, those exemplary bits of behavior with other people and see if we can raise the bar for everybody. So I only got a few more minutes here, and then I want to see if you guys have some thoughts, questions, or ideas yourself that come out of all this, or maybe if you reflect on your own history, especially in most of you, as I see in this list, have used, maybe even been in our programs to use performance thinking. What we're really looking here is insights or ahas or interesting applications that you've discovered because of the way you think using this framework. But one of the things that I believe, and I created this list probably 20 years ago, and I just was trying to do it as a way to help the people that we trained and certified to sort of categorize what kind of projects they were involved in. But a couple of my close colleagues have said this was one of the most useful things in our stuff. And what we realized is that there's really only 6 kinds of performance improvement projects that we can identify. Now, within each category, there's a lot of stuff you might do, but what differs in them to some extent is how you find the outputs. So if you're defining and supporting a role or individual, whether it's in hiring, onboarding, training, ongoing coaching, uh, uh, um, succession planning, whatever it is, you want to know what their outputs are. And so you would use the equivalent of that individual performance map that I showed you earlier. You would say, who are your customers? What do you deliver outputs to? Or what are the outputs? If it's a process, you do it differently. You define the sequence of activities, and then you say, what does each activity produce? And then you go from there. The third one, if you're trying to optimize training ROI, you say, well, okay, we're going to do training for sure. So you start out by saying, let's turn our training objectives into outputs that people will be able to produce on the job. And then let's not only look at our instructional procedures and methodologies, but let's look at the other boxes in the 6 boxes model so that during training and after training, there will be strong support of applying what they learn on the job. And the fourth one, implementation planning, really, if you're doing change management or trying to have a new thing, you say, what are the outputs of the accomplishments that define that new thing? And let's back out from that and figure out what the behavior influences are now that are in place and what we need to do, how we need to change expectations, what we need to do with respect to feedback, possibly what tools, job aids, resources, et cetera, we need to provide for people in the short term or maybe forever. How do we be sure there's some positive consequences here for doing the thing right, informally and maybe more formally in some ways? Cultural values, we even can approach that because cultural values are about producing a set of outputs, but with behavior that aligns with our values around here, whether it's kindness or focus on the customer or whatever it is. So we can go through the analysis, but when we get to outputs and we're defining criteria, we say, okay, what's a good output given our cultural values? And then what's the behavior for producing that is alignment with the values? And then finally, what we realized years ago, and I've done more work on sales performance than any other area, is it's not really a process. It's this in business to business sales in particular, it's usually a series of phases which kind of move from one to the other, but it's not strictly a sequence. There may be a number of things you do when you're trying to qualify prospects. There may be a number of things you do when you're in front of customers. There may be a number of things you do as follow-up. And so we can identify the outputs in each of those phases by observing and interviewing top salespeople. And then we can build to that, again, following the same logic. So I would say that this covers I've never encountered a project that didn't fit into one or some hybrid of these. And here's another way to look at it. Years ago, when we were first talking about training people to do our stuff, we said, what are all the different kinds of applications? That is, the things people could do, and those are listed down the left. And who are all the different potential audiences? Now, you might vary with the language you use here, but that was another way we thought about it. And wherever there's an X here, it suggests those different players could do these things with the performance thinking logic in our models and process. So just to give you a few examples, then I want to see in the last few minutes if you guys have any. We have many cases been brought in to look at customer service and getting new representatives up to speed faster. We published an article years ago on AT&T Wireless where we were able to took used to 2 months from first day on the job to final productivity in the AT&T Wireless customer service environment. We reduced that to 2 weeks by being accomplishment-based, by building fluency, et cetera. Or implementing a new online clinical research documentation system. One of my colleagues did that in a big biotech company. Several-year project, applied performance thinking step by step, worked beautifully. Reduce confusion and anger in the process for approving sales materials. I did a large process improvement project years ago where a person in a biotech company had to bring brochures or slides that were going to be used in sales training or other stuff that would eventually affect customers through this very difficult panel of attorneys, clinical specialists, scientists, and regulatory compliance people, and get approved in it. And it was a mess. And so we were able to improve that quite a bit. We had something like 17 recommendations that made a big difference. Improve teachers' relationships with parents of their students. I encounter this a lot when I work with special education organizations or applied behavior analysis organizations. You talk about the relationship as an output or an accomplishment. You say, what are the criteria for a good one? We want parents that will ask us questions, that will, follow guidelines that we give them for work with their kids at home, et cetera. How do we produce that relationship that enables that? And there's a lot of ways to do it, but that's a great opportunity for applying performance thinking. Um, ensure that new trainees apply what they learn in the job. This is our routine approach to training, where if we work with somebody on training, we say, yeah, well, wait a minute, let's look at the behavior influences needed to support and continue to develop this performance on the job. Business to business account managers. I had a company, Product Knowledge Systems, which was devoted to this. And you just basically take the account manager's work and you define the major and minor accomplishments or outputs or milestones in it, and you build to that with behavior influences. And then the last one, we've done some work, and I mentioned we even published an article on this, the whole values thing. So those are big, hairy projects. But there's some informal ones too, and this is what I'd like you guys to think about. Like I was in the call center at one point, and I asked this a couple of the reps, like, how do you know which software you're supposed to use to get this? Because you can do it in a couple different ways. And they said, well, it depends on what supervisor we've got on that shift, because this one tells me to use this and that one tells me to use this. And so we said, wait a minute, let's just have them tell you to use the same one. I don't care which one it is. Let's get clear about this. Or another organization where they had centralized their HR business partners, but they still had a bunch of them out in the field. It was a bank, and they were literally getting in each other's ways. And we said, wait a minute, let's look at the outputs. Let's do customer diagrams here, or individual performance maps rather, and figure out what the outputs are. Maybe that's why they're trying to do the same stuff, and we can clear up the difference between these roles. Or how can you get up to speed in this new kind of proposal? A lot of times it's just create a template, create a good job aid for all the sections in the proposal, some criteria and examples, possibly a library. It's not a big project. You can pull it off fairly quickly. Or why should I care about these stupid notes? In applied behavior analysis organizations, you get people have to have session notes, and they sometimes do really lousy session notes. The next person couldn't possibly understand it. And so why should I even care about this? Well, the performance chain helps us think through the fact that the session notes deliver some value to the organization. And as I mentioned earlier in the customer service environment, that's often about the next person being able to do the right thing for this client. In the case of an applied behavior analysis organization, it might be whether we get reimbursed by the insurance company or not. So just thinking through with the performance chain, you recognize you can take this output, this note, and you can link it credibly up to organizational results to get people's attention. Or the findings and recommendations reports. Again, you can give people a template and work to that. She's an amazingly productive sales rep. We had a client that had this person who had like a close ratio, like almost everybody she talked to, she sold something to. It was a telesales organization. Finally, I had some people go interview her quickly. It wasn't really a project. And she just said, oh, I just sort out the kinds of clients that I know I'm going to get business with, so I don't even call them. Just that one step made a difference, etc. The point is, and I'm hoping that some of you have some examples like this where you say, oh, you could just do this and it would make a difference, kind of in a meeting or in an ad hoc situation. So that's what I wanted to see. And we can look in the chat box. Nobody's chatted, it looks like. But what I'm wondering is if any of you might have some things to add to this, examples of your own. And I think I can set this up. If you want to ask to speak, I think I can approve you to speak if anybody would like to. Does anybody have anything they want to say or examples, instances? Anyone? Scott is here. Scott is one of the most accomplished performance improvement people I know. I don't know if you got any examples, Scott. Just looking at all of you, D, people that might have some insights. Anyone? Oops. Scott. So Scott's been a hardcore ABCD practitioner for a long time, and so that's Joe Harless's accomplishment-based curriculum development. Yep. Yeah, so fluency, that's a big one, Scott. And I didn't even talk about that. But if people are looking at the chat box, yeah, in box four, there's this whole thing about you can teach people to accuracy and they'll probably forget it in 2 weeks. Whereas if you give people sufficient focused practice on the components. So thank you for that, Scott. I think that's exactly right. And I didn't even say anything about that one, but that's part of it. Anyone else have any examples to share of insights or things you've learned um, about being accomplishment based or about being using the six boxes model or the equivalent? Is another Scott. Oh my gosh. I'm just reading what you say, Scott. You're in the throes of mapping the training life cycle with the sales side of your company. Closer you get to counting workouts, make customers more agile and iterative. Yes, yes, that's right. And you can also, in that situation, you can get successful salespeople together and talk about milestones and share strategies and tactics. At least I've seen that work in some places. So your training might be there's a couple things that our best people do depending on what the situation is. Uh, Jeremiah, Hubjack categorize approach a project where Great Place to Work survey has been implemented and the request is to improve climate. What I would say, Jeremiah, is if you look at, that's a good question to raise. I had a big insight probably 10 years ago when I looked at the Gallup 12 employee engagement survey. And what I recognized was that the items in that 12 item survey that people have to mark from not at all to a whole bunch on a scale of 1 to 5 line up with the six boxes beautifully. So what we've learned is that if we can, and I can share this with you if you email me or text me, we've got a framework that fits into the six boxes that incorporates the factors identified with from the Gallup poll. Like, I know it is expected me of work. I have the tools and resources I needed. I mean, these are things straight out of the Gallup poll that predict better employee engagement and satisfaction. Uh, we can basically teach our managers, supervisors, and leaders to practice things which put in place those behavior influences for people. And I would love if you've got a project like that, I would love to work with you a little bit on it, because what we've seen is it's not that hard if managers understand that their jobs are to arrange conditions for the people to perform well and be happy. And if you give them a framework like the six boxes with some practices in each cell, they can begin to get a lot better. D, people also, yeah, they often ask for training. Yes, exactly. I mean, one of the things, D, that I've seen, and I'm sure you have too, is like when I'm first encountering some new client, even or new stakeholder, just even drawing the six boxes model on their whiteboard or their screen or a napkin, literally, and you say, "Look, there's training down here, but there's this other stuff that you can control, and it's a lot of times a lot cheaper." Training might not even be required if you give them a good job aid and some expectations and feedback. But even if it is, as you say, let's consider the other things to report. So you're on a project, Jen, to redesign upskill training. Yeah. So what I would like to suggest, and I know this is counter the current fad, but everybody's talking about skills-based training. That was some big new deal. And the examples that I've seen of it don't look any better than competency-based training from my perspective, which to me is the worst thing that ever happened to human resources, where the descriptions of skills are so vague that it's not really all that useful. So I would much rather say, let's design training based on the outputs these people need to produce. And then maybe we can say what the behavior is for producing them, or maybe we allow some flexibility there. But when people know if your training objectives are at the end of this, you're going to be able to produce this to this criterion, it gets a heck of a lot easier for everybody to measure and know if they were successful or not. And then D, yeah, I agree. I should probably find that slide if I can, but I don't think I can do it in the time we have left. But I'm happy if anybody wants to email me, or I'll probably even have most of your email addresses. Um, I think there actually is one of our webinars at YouTube on performancethinking.tv that has the framework of the 6 boxes and Gallup poll, but it's a big deal. Anyway, thank you for your involvement, guys. Our time is up. I'm happy to stick around a little bit longer, but if anybody has any further comments or so Scott and the project to support an inclusive culture at work, simply defining good looks like. Yeah, well, yeah, inclusive culture. I think one of the things that I believe, and I published an article that I think you can find on performancethinking.com in the resource library years ago in the Journal of Organizational Behavior Management that was about culture change from a very different perspective. What it said is, what my belief is about these culture things is that they look different in different departments. Now, maybe inclusive is one of those ones that would look kind of the same every place. But I think in IT and sales and HR and, operations, I think a lot of times the jobs are such that the way we would practice a given value that's written on the wall or espoused by leadership would look different. And so if we could enable our managers and supervisors to define the jobs of their people in their departments and their teams in terms of outputs, and then we looked at the outputs and said, oh, to which one of these does this value even apply? Like, for example, the design of a hiring team, probably the inclusivity value would apply to that a lot. We better be sure that the hiring team reflects the full range of people we'd like to include, or hiring decisions, or people involved in customer service, study teams or whatever. A lot of decisions and configured groups of people need to meet the criteria that they represent the audience or the population we're working with. I think if you start out with outputs, look at which ones the value relates to, figure out how that changes the criteria for that, and then look at what behavior for producing it, you get a lot closer to having the behavior you need to live those values. Yeah, does inclusive include accessibility? So we can get in a whole conversation with this one about so-called DEI that our president has trashed. And I especially appreciate all the comments I've seen about if we didn't use the acronym, if we just said diversity, equity, and inclusion, and maybe that would come across a little differently because those things mean different stuff. But I shouldn't get political about it. Anyway, thank you for your examples. Some takeaways, quick takeaways. First of all, focusing on accomplishments helps us optimize value, and I think that has a lot of implications. Secondly, I believe that the simplicity of our model, so you can see the whole thing on a single page, lets you see the whole system, and it gives you some insights that you might not have otherwise. The plain Englishness of our thing makes a difference because it allows you to understand, communicate more quickly. The logic applies to just about anything. I think the 6 types provide some clarity, and I think we can add value at any level in an organization. So, all right. Well, thank you, everybody. I think we're probably done. Thanks so much for showing up. And the recording of this will be on YouTube probably within the next few days. So I'm gonna sign off now. So thank you very much.